Hi. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today. One housekeeping rule, if I could please ask everyone to silence their cell phones so they don't go off while you guys are hearing from our speaker today. My name is Miguel Perez. I am the Associate Director of Engagement Programs here at the Art Institute of Chicago. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here to hear about this groundbreaking exhibition, The Language of Beauty in African Art. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of hearing from the exhibition's curator, Constantine Petridis, who is the chair and curator of African art here at the Art Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in joining Constantine to the stage.
Thank you, Miguel, for this introduction, and good afternoon, and welcome. Welcome to the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome to this auditorium. Welcome to this lecture, especially for those of you who've come from New York and elsewhere and have had to go through this terrible snowstorm to get here on this Saturday afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to say that, of course, I hope you will make your way to the exhibition. That's why this lecture is happening to begin with, if you haven't seen it already, but also if you could make a note of future lectures related to the exhibition, which you'll, of course, read about, and you'll be the first ones to read about them in the Member magazine. On December 10th, there's Julie Crooks from the Art Gallery of Ontario who will be speaking. On January 28th, Balaji Campbell of the Rhode Island School of Design. And then on February 11th, our colleague Nii Kwarkopom from the Detroit Institute of Arts. So hope that you'll be coming back for that, for those various talks as well. I am very happy to share this exhibition with you through this introductory lecture. The reason is to celebrate the opening. It opened to you members yesterday, and it will be open to the public tomorrow on Sunday. The exhibition focuses on beauty and more broadly on aesthetics, on the evaluation and the expression, beginning with the expression and then the evaluation of the arts of Africa, of the so-called traditional or tradition-based arts of Africa through the perspective of the African communities, the makers, the users, the patrons, the audiences who created and experienced this art. And in that sense, it offers an alternative perspective, an indigenous, local, emic perspective, as we like to call it, on issues of beauty and ugliness, its opposite, the opposite of beauty, ugliness. And it covers a wide or a vast area. It's basically dealing with a large part of sub-Saharan Africa, and it treats about 65 different cultures that are represented through 250 plus works of art coming from many different countries, contemporary countries, and many different cultures. And they represent a vast area, basically going from West Africa to Southern Africa. This cover of the catalog is meant to not only entice you to look for the catalog and maybe even purchase it or order it, but also to give you a sense of the great variety of materials that you will encounter when visiting this exhibition. The exhibition starts, and I promise I won't give you a step-by-step, gallery-by-gallery introduction to the exhibition. It's a vast show. There's 8 different main sections. I'm just picking out a few objects and a few themes or ideas to give you a sense of what to expect and to hopefully also and especially convey what the key ideas and themes and arguments of the exhibition are. The exhibition starts with a small section which has the title, Whose Aesthetics? And that's basically where the question is asked, who determines what is beautiful and what is ugly in African art? And implied in that is our assessment of beauty and ugliness the same or different of the assessment that is held in the African communities and among the people where these artworks were created and experienced? And it focuses on the Chokwe because Chokwe art, including this particular figure, a representation of a local cultural hero, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, is one of these widely acclaimed and celebrated works of African art that was sold at an auction in 2006 in Paris for a record amount, and it was praised for its beauty and qualities. But in the extensive catalog to the auction, no mention was made of local Chokwe aesthetic criteria or assessments. And interestingly enough, whereas many parts of the continent and many cultures in Africa have not received due attention when it comes to local aesthetics, the Chokwe are one of the many exceptions to the rule, where thanks to the work of art historians and anthropologists, Marie-Louise Vastin in Belgium, Daniel Crowley in the United States, who actually know quite a lot about local aesthetics in Chokwe culture. We know what the word for beauty is. We know also Chibema. We know also that the Chokwe appreciate and value objects made with great technical skill and speaking of craftsmanship. And obviously, these objects meet those criteria and expectations. But so again, in many in much scholarship and in many writings about African art, those aesthetic criteria are rarely addressed. And so what our exhibition hopes to do is to highlight those local criteria, explain why certain objects are considered beautiful or ugly, explain how these qualities are being described. It focuses on language, on vocabularies, on sophisticated terminology that is used locally to express those complicated ideas, and in doing so it hopes to reevaluate some of this art and to demonstrate that not always do art tastes coincide, and the attempt is, or the hope is also to erase prejudices and preconceived notions that have for a very long time prevented people from appreciating this art. And interestingly also to note is that now almost 50 years ago, a Belgian historian, Jan van Sina, deplored the scarcity of aesthetic analysis from the viewpoint of the cultures from which the arts emerged. And in 1989, so not that much later, an American art historian, Moni Adams, in a big historiographical review article, said that aesthetics were one of the most neglected topics in the study of African art. And unfortunately, until this day, very few cultures have actually been studied with regard to their aesthetic concepts and notions. And when it comes to exhibitions, in this country, there's only one real predecessor to the project that we've put together here, and that was an exhibition in 1986 at the former Center for African Art, an exhibition called African Aesthetics, curated by Susan Vogel, which also covered this topic, but on a much more, if I may say so, modest and concise scale, using the collection of one private collector only. So our exhibition is more ambitious in its scope, in its scale, and also in its reliance on a broader and deeper body of literature and scholarship. To briefly go back to these Chokwe figures, Chibinda Ilunga, there's a number of examples, but there are few, and one of them is this example on the left that is now at the Cuba Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. These images are usually identified as the representation of the Chokwe culture hero, Chibinda Ilunga. And this culture hero was a renowned hunter and founder of Chokwe society, civilization, and chiefship. He holds a staff in one hand and a horn, a medicine horn, that are two attributes that, among other things, represent hunting equipment or equipment used during the hunt. And these attributes evoke masculine power and endurance, and those same ideas are conveyed through the dynamic energy of the sculpture, through anatomical details, the muscular body, the flexed arms and legs, the large hands and feet. And all these attributes represent or express political and religious authority. And as such, these objects would have been placed on an altar to serve, to fight off physical as well as metaphysical threats. So here you have an indication of the appearance of the object that serves a particular function, and a function that is mainly located in the world of spirits, in the communication with the other world. And that's the theme that will come back later. But on your right, you find the female counterpoint to that ideal of male beauty in this mask of Mwana Pwo, or Pwo, the woman or the young girl, a female mask with realistic facial features, including scarification marks on the forehead and on the cheeks, chipped teeth that imitate locally recognized ways to enhance the physical appearance of a person and especially of a woman. And these masks are considered idealized portraits of a real woman. So they would actually represent real people from within the community. What is especially striking about this example is that it's so well preserved with an elaborate hairstyle that consists of fragile fibers and incorporates pieces of metal jewelry and beads, and it's a faithful imitation of a variety of real-life adornments. It would be worn with a costume and danced in an elegant choreography in a performance that embodies the nurturing qualities that Chokwe society values or used to value in women in particular. So those two objects in some ways open the theme in a very straightforward way, and then throughout the exhibition you'll see that the same themes are elaborated upon through other examples from other cultures with other understandings and interpretations. Briefly, I want to mention that my own interest for this topic of aesthetics goes far back. I'm not going to reveal you my age. I look much older than I actually am, but I did a PhD dissertation in the 90s on the Lulua people of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and their art is also known for its very beautiful sculptures from a local Lulua perspective. And they have a term, bwimpe, that would characterize an image like this mother and child figure on a stick. That is one of the highlights of Lulua art as we know it today through collections in the West. And bwimpe is the word for beauty, but also the word for goodness in Lulua culture, in Lulua language. And that idea of the combination of the beautiful and the good, the visually appealing, the aesthetic in a visual sense with the ethic, the moral good, is very common and widespread throughout much of the continent. So that's what led me in part to this interest in aesthetics, and now decades later I finally have the chance to do this exhibition. But I should also acknowledge a close colleague of mine from my student days in the medieval times in Belgium, Wilfried van Damme, who's actually also the main contributor to the catalog. He's a Dutch art historian and anthropologist who studied and worked for a long time in Belgium. And he, in 1996, published a book based on his dissertation called Beauty in Context, towards an anthropological approach to aesthetics. And he summarized much of the literature that was available at the time. And his research, which has continued to this day, is summarized in a very compelling and in-depth article in the catalog that served as a framework for the project as a whole. Now, many African art aficionados and enthusiasts ignore aesthetics of African art because they're so focused on the contextual setting of the arts and the functions and meanings of the arts. They often falsely believe or assume that the purpose or content are not really relevant to ideas of beauty or ugliness. Another reason why many people, including us, so-called specialists or people who deal with this professionally, have not paid due attention to the arts of Africa is that we're very often looking at the art of Africa through the lens of the European avant-garde artists and art critics of the early 20th century, who are credited with the so-called discovery of African art, or more specifically, the recognition of African art as art. The influence of African and other non-Western arts on European and by extension American modern art is widely studied and recognized. It's known as that movement in art history labeled primitivism, and it continues to be, despite criticism, despite questioning, despite theoretical literature against it, it continues to be often the predominant perspective applied to the evaluation and appreciation of African art. And that topic is actually addressed in the exhibition catalog in the essay by Yael Biro, a colleague now in France, which specifically considers this historical moment that is generally considered the turning point in the transformation of African objects from ethnography to fine art. But this early recognition of African objects as art did not entail an acknowledgement of African aesthetic philosophies and aesthetic vocabularies. Of course, it should not surprise, because there were barely any in situ research studies available on this topic, and most of the objects that these avant-garde artists and critics encountered in the West had been taken out of Africa without any information and were literally orphan objects. So there was no way to actually delve deeper and really understand how these objects would have been experienced and aesthetically appreciated locally. So that is one excuse that we can make for the people who are part of this movement and of this early recognition of African art as art. Kota art, of which you see an example on the right, it's one of 7 examples in the exhibition, and there could have been 100 because there's many of them known in many different substyles. These objects are so-called reliquary guardian figures. They literally guard the relics of important ancestors. They were a favorite category among the early enthusiasts of African art, especially in Paris. And it was, of course, the abstraction of the rendering of the human body that enthused the proponents of the new artistic movement known as Cubism. Whereas works from the Cameroon grass fields, like this impressive and expressive Tungunga crest mask from Bamum, from the Bamum people, would serve as an inspiration for expressionists in Germany, and the Fauves, their counterparts in France, including Maurice de Vlaming, who once owned this particular sculpture. Now, there is a category of art which is also represented in our first gallery, which deals with Western appreciations and Western appropriations. The art that actually is a little bit different from the art that we just looked at is Cuba art. Cuba art also enjoyed an unusual early recognition because of its creativity and craftsmanship. And these 2 examples on the screen demonstrate some of the reasons why this kind of art was appreciated and valued very early onwards. When these royal works of art, because they belong to the king and his court and his retinue, when they first came to the attention of audiences in the United States and also in the United Kingdom first, through late 19th century and 20th century collections and writings of people like the Black American Protestant missionary William Henry Shepherd and later the Hungarian ethnographer Emil Tordai, were instantly admired and greatly respected. The general public praised Cuba art for its refinement and its relative naturalism at the moment that Tordai's so-called Cuba collection, an ensemble or an assemblage of objects that he had brought back from his time spent in Cuba country, when this ensemble was displayed in London in 1909, it was greatly admired and respected. But now, interestingly, and in contrast with the arts of the grassfields in Cameroon or the Kota people, which we saw in the previous slide, there is and there has been for a long time research available on Cuba aesthetics, pioneered by another Belgian scholar called Jan van Sina, whose name I mentioned, who already deplored the availability of studies about beauty and ugliness in the 1980s. But he, in the 1950s, spent considerable time asking for vernacular Cuba perspectives on beauty and writing down the terms that Cuba people used to evaluate this art and to describe it. And he too found out that the Cuba use a single word, bushek, to denote both formal and moral qualities, a word that basically unites our words for beauty and goodness once again. And the opposite of this, a word that combines ugliness and immorality, is what the Cuba referred to as buepi. And what the Cuba particularly like is this covering of the surface with very intricate, complicated geometric motifs. And they do that in a variety of their art forms, not only in sculpture, but also in textiles. And the exhibition has one beautiful textile from this particular part of Africa, from our own museum collection on display. Now, I've already alluded to this, but this research, even though it's not been fully recognized and translated in exhibitions and in publications today, the research into aesthetics goes back quite long or quite far in time. It didn't even start in the 50s with the man that I just mentioned. It goes back to the 30s, the early 30s. And it's these 2 scholars whose names are represented in the slides. You see Hans Himmelheber selecting objects among the Ballet people in the 30s and using local perceptions and again assessments of quality to make choices, to decide what to acquire and what not to acquire, with people offering him objects for sale and trying to basically praise their merchandise. And that was a very original approach, obviously. And again, though he published about it in the early 30s, it's not widely consulted and applied at all. And the same is true for the research done by a Belgian scholar, again, Pieter Jan van den Houten, in the late 1930s, who became an apprentice to carvers, to mask carvers, learned how to carve masks locally, and through that work established very elaborate vocabularies and categories of how dark carvers and also audience members would assess the art that they created, and found out why certain carvers are more popular, more successful than others, and why the work of certain carvers is much more in demand than that of other carvers. And what he also observed is that for the Dao people, ultimately beauty is again closely tied to the religious function of the art, that objects are made beautiful not so much for human eyes, but for spirit eyes. So the research goes back to the 30s, so almost a century old. And then in the 50s and 60s, we see the start of scholars in Europe, in the United States, but also on the African continent. People like the humanistic scholar Leopold Sédar Senghor and the philosopher or sociologist Haris Memel Fauté both recommended to focus on the subject of aesthetics, and they emphasized the importance to integrate aesthetics into what they refer to as sub-Saharan worldviews, and especially suggested to focus on language as a conceptual analysis, as a starting point to examine the subject. And so there are many other Africans in certain parts of the continent that have continued that research, and today we are best informed about cultures in Nigeria, the Igbo with Chike Anyakor, and also the Yoruba with people like Roland Abiodun and Babatunde Lawal, among others. And Babatunde is one of the authors to the exhibition catalog as well. And then afterwards there were American scholars as well, art historians, most notably Robert Farris Thompson at Yale, who turned aesthetics into their main focus of interest and research. All these studies and the exhibition focus on the idea that the arts of Africa are what in our midst is often referred to or qualified as art for life's sake rather than art for art's sake. So the art is not made just to be art and specifically to just look at. It's art that serves a purpose, that serves a function, that has a meaning, and that contributes in a very deep and integral way to the survival and the well-being of both individuals and societies. Hence the importance to embed the study of aesthetics, of beauty and ugliness in that broader social-cultural context. The two themes that I alluded to that are central in this exhibition project and in the study of aesthetics is, on the one hand, the religious function of beauty, as I just mentioned, and ugliness as well. So religious function and religious dimension of those two concepts, and then also, and most significantly, the interrelatedness of formal and moral beauty and ugliness, goodness and wickedness, beauty and goodness. So these are themes that occur throughout the continent, and one of the first cases in which these ideas were examined and described is to be found among the Lega people, which again occupy an area in the exhibition, specifically an area that deals with this, with the functions, the religious functions of beauty, and that specifically focuses on these moral connotations of beauty. And so for the Lega people, they have a word, busoga, B-U-S-O-G-A, which is again a concept that embraces both moral praise and visual beauty. The two go hand in hand. And in fact, it's visual beauty, but also character and proper social behavior. So there's a social dimension to this concept as well. It's a key concept in the philosophy of the Lega people, and it's a paramount element of education in a closed society, a club, if you wish, open to men and women, but different categories. It's called Bwami for the men. It's a voluntary initiation society where literally every man aspires to become a member of and climb up as he proceeds through life. And the education and advancement in that closed association called Bwami happens through proverbs and sayings, and those proverbs encapsulate or capture the key philosophy, the key values of Boami society and specifically of Lega culture. And the ultimate goal in life for Boami members, men and women, is actually to achieve Busoga, the complete blending of ethics and aesthetics in one's being. And qualities of Busoga are moderation both in a moral and in a visual sense, avoidance of embellishment, but also moderation in behavior, in attitude. Also smoothness of a surface. You see many of these objects are smoothened, are rubbed with leaves and stones to make them look shiny and polished. And so a smooth surface is a metaphor for a smooth, harmonious social relationships. So again, there is this reflection of the visual into the moral, into behavior, and to social life. And in fact, they have a word for that too, ibonga. That is the smoothness that the Lega people admire so much in their art and in their culture. The Ballet are another culture about which we have considerably more information when it comes to their notions of aesthetics than many other cultures in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's largely, but not exclusively, but largely the result of the work of Susan Vogel, the person who I mentioned earlier, who devoted a lot of time in her early research days to the social cultural embedding of notions of beauty and ugliness. And in this case, Ballet artists apply these notions in a variety of visual expressions, including anthropomorphic figures representing humans, both men and women, that typically serve two categories of spirits. So in the Ballet case, we have this very explicit relationship between beauty and religion. The religious function of beauty is prominent in that culture and in the arts of that culture. So they have two categories of spirits. One of them deals with nature spirits that are diagnosed as the source of a person's misfortune. They're called asiye usu. And they can cause illness or even death. And the conviction is that having a figure sculptured that should be strikingly beautiful, according to local Ballet standards, it will be attractive to the spirit, and the spirit will be lured in order to take possession of the spirit, and through that transfer, basically veer away the trouble, the misfortune, the problem. So it will, the sculpture as such becomes like an abode, a home for the spirit, and it will receive offerings in order to keep it happy and therefore remedy the problem in question. But the Ballet also have an even more interesting type of anthropomorphic sculpture that is related to another category of spirits. They're called Blolo Bian, Blolo Bla, where every adult has or is believed to have a spiritual partner in the other world. The other world is Blolo. And humans reside there before birth, and they return there after death. Women have a Blolo Bian, a man in the other world. Men have a Blolo Bla, a woman. And these consorts from the other world feel neglected, at times become jealous of their human lovers, and they will express this unhappiness and this neglect by causing trouble to their human earthly partner in a variety of ways. They can cause infertility, they can cause illness, etc. And in order to restore the good relationship with one's spirit spouse, one has a figure like the one on the screen made in order to flatter and therefore again appease that spiritual partner. Now in practice you cannot distinguish one category of sculpture from the other. They both look alike, so it's impossible, according to the most thorough research, to say whether this is an example of one of these spirit spouses or nature spirits, but both express and convey the same ideas about Ballet beauty and the qualities that are praised in figural sculpture. And for the Ballet, the term for beautiful is klanman, again a term that has ethical and social connotations. And here, like among the Lega, the Ballet perceive an interrelationship between visual and moral that is and they very directly refer to statues as a reference for beauty. They say, they qualify a statue on the basis of a real human person. So they say, in order for a statue, a figure to look beautiful, it has to be as beautiful as a person of the village. It has to represent an ideal human being, and that ideal human being is recognized through a well-cared hairstyle, scarifications, features that basically add and enhance the human body. So that is obviously recognizable in these figures, and what it all points to is that a person that embodies these qualities is considered to be healthy, hardworking, and fertile. It embodies, she or he embody the values of this agricultural society. And so in evaluating statues or figures that strive to present the human ideal, the Ballet appreciate those visual features that evoke these values. And they do that through a smooth, unblemished skin, as you see on these carvings, with enhanced body decorations, scarifications of all sorts, but the skin as such is smooth and unblemished, which alludes to good personal hygiene and also health. They also value long, strong necks and muscular calves that are needed to transport heavy loads on the head and to work hard on the fields for agricultural work, and a youthful appearance in general that connotes fertility, but also good health and the capability of doing hard work. So a Ballet statue or figure fulfills its spirit-pleasing purpose well when it is clanman, beautiful in both moral and visual sense, when it presents this visual metaphor, or is a visual metaphor of these Ballet social-cultural values. So it's important to recognize at this point that beauty and function are not mutually exclusive, and more importantly, that beauty is an essential criteria or requirement for an object to function properly. It is because it's so beautiful that the spirits will come and inhabit the object, and that they will actually exercise their power and their influence, positive influence, on the people who rely on them and invoke them, and that they help to solve all kinds of problems. The same ideas are reflected in these so-called entertainment mask dances that are generically called blow, and then specifically Ndoma is a category of portrait mask, like this example here from our own collection, also considered portraits that again represent specific individuals, and that again reflect many of these features that are locally considered signs of beauty: the smooth and lustrous surface, the healthy skin, the high foreheads that represents intellect, and the scarifications and elaborate hairstyles and other adornments that enhance and beautify the human body, the natural body. As a kind of a side note or interlude, I would just like to point out that this exhibition includes a vast majority of anthropomorphic objects that in one way or another represent or refer to the human body. And that's a deliberate choice, and it could be considered a shortcoming because not all African art is anthropomorphic, but in fact a lot of it is, and it's not a coincidence. It's not only because that's the kind of art that was most quickly and most easily considered to be art or to fit in our Western categories of art. It is also because the human form is a source of reference for so much artistic and aesthetic expression on the African continent. The reference to the human body is paramount. You see it in freestanding figures and in masks, like the examples that we showed, but also in household objects, in furniture, in architecture, etc. And so all these art forms reflect a dedicated interest in human anatomy. The emphasis is always on an idealized, an enhanced expression of corporeal beauty. Idealism or idealized realism is indeed a common trait throughout much of the African cultural landscape. And this example of this red mask that comes from the Eastern Pende people called Kambanda from the Riedberg Museum is another great expression of these values. It represents Kambanda, the wife of the chief, a female mask character, always danced by a man, but performed in masquerades to communicate and communicate with and thank the ancestors. And here too, the face, the hair, they epitomize local ideals of feminine beauty. And particularly interesting is what the Pende themselves call zanze, bedroom eyes, the mysterious closed eyes that are meant to lure male admirers, but also the spirits. And so that's one of the many features that will characterize a beautiful Pende mask in Pende conceptions about beauty. And again, you see the scarification marks and the filed teeth, but also the wig, the hairdo that consists of these hundreds of fine braids, and then also the earrings that imitate, as you see it on the portrait of the young woman next to it, imitate real-life body adornments as they were worn and used in the period that this particular mask was observed and acquired in Africa. But slightly more subtle and equally beautiful, but also anthropomorphic in reference, are these two objects that are either worn on the body and therefore have an anthropomorphic dimension, or that are in the shape of a human body, whereas they could be in any other shape. And the fact that they are in this, for instance, the pipe on the right, the idea is that it is representing the image of a woman as an expression of the fact that this is actually an important object that connotes the status, the prestige of its owner. But it also underscores the importance of tobacco consumption that is used in communications with the other world, with the ancestors. And so tobacco is important in order to establish this rapport. And that's one of the reasons why these objects receive this kind of attention and are decorated as prominently. But even other things that are not anthropomorphic, of course, deserve our attention. And there's very many forms of ephemeral art, earth sculptures, for instance, that are not typically collected and brought to the West, that stay in Africa, that are also expressions of beauty and of a sense of aesthetics. And I just wanted to point that out in passing. And then a final element to keep in mind is the importance of movement, of dance, of choreography, and that looking at masks in a museum setting turns them into static objects, whereas in the African context and in the environment where they are created and especially used, these masks and even figures are rarely seen in and by themselves and without movement, without choreography. And those aspects are essential contributors to the aesthetic experience and evaluation. And you see it, I think, beautifully illustrated. On the one hand, this white maiden spirit mask that on the right, but then also how it's danced with other maskers and with a costume that goes with it, and that here we really have the idea of African art in motion, of the fact that it's African art becomes multisensorial, the movement, but also the other senses are triggered. And of course, this is one aspect to keep in mind when looking and focusing on objects like we typically do as museum visitors and as museum curators. And I know that my time is coming to a close very soon, but I'm going to end with these few powerful images that, yes, do suggest power, but also illustrate the other side of this dialectic. We've looked at beautiful objects and qualities that denote beauty, but in the exhibition, towards the end of it, you'll see a whole range of objects from a variety of cultures that denote various aspects of what we generally call the ugly, the anti-aesthetic, the opposite to beauty. And there's words in all the cultures in question to denote that concept of ugliness, and they typically are interpreted as the opposite and in contrasting ways with what is considered beautiful. And important in this idea of the ugly is that these objects often refer to a dualistic opposition that is quite common throughout Africa between culture and nature, between the village and the wilderness. Idealized beauty is always presumed to be human-made and culturally enhanced, as we've seen, and associated with the realm of the village, of the community. But deliberate ugliness is the diametrical opposite of created beauty. It often correlates with a wild and untamed realm of the forest outside the boundaries of the village. And while cultivated beauty is admired and desired in life and art, the idea of ugliness is feared and rejected. And artists who intend to instill fear through their objects may represent ugliness by mimicking or referencing animals, especially powerful and fearsome ones. Their features will incorporate or will be incorporated, these animal features will be incorporated into fantastic compositions that comprise elements sourced literally from the natural world. You see it here a wooden carving in the form of this dragon-like helmet mask with this muzzle with teeth, elements carved in the mask, but then elements also added, horns of a variety of animals, and a crusty surface that turned this object into, as the Bamana and related Senufo people see it in the border between Côte d'Ivoire and Mali, they turned this into a dark, dangerous object, an object that inspires fear and terror, and therefore also power and authority. It's forbidden for the general population. It's related to an association called Como, which is especially popular among, or especially prevalent among the Bamana people and their neighbors in that region. The members of the Como Association that is responsible for this helmet mask will consider it terrifying and intimidating. And we actually have on our audio tour the voice of Kassim Kone, born and raised in Mali, currently a professor here in the United States, and also a contributor to the catalog, who very eloquently captures how these kind of objects would have been experienced by the few men in Bamana society who could witness them, who could experience them. And here you see layers of sacrificial materials and offerings that create this characteristic crusty surface that enhance the visual ugliness as well as the inherent energy of these objects. These objects, powerful objects in Bamana culture, have what the Bamana refer to as nyama, life force or energy. And so Como as an organization wields extensive social, economic, cultural, judicial, and above all religious powers within their community, and it carries out rituals that involves healing and the manipulation of power objects like this mask. They are literally considered horrific and potentially even deadly, and they are locally called dibi, which basically means obscurity and death, and they are surrounded by much secrecy. And so here you have a great example of the category of ugliness among the Bamana, and you find similar ideas in a variety of other cultures that are also represented in the exhibition, and often, as I said, horns, pointed extensions or crusty layered surfaces that obscure the surface of the sculpture underneath it. And here you see an interesting contrast between Ballet, human figures that represent beauty on the left, and then this monkey figure on the right that represents the opposite of beauty and also connotes inherent power and danger. Again, a crusty layer and also a very different and unusual position even within that genre as such. I'm going to end on this slide, but just to let you know that there's much more to explore in the exhibition. But one of the things that we focus on to help people understand how beauty is defined are these local standards or criteria of beauty. And there's many that have been recorded, and in many cultures there's multiple criteria that are at play and that are applied to the same object. But for the sake of clarity, we've actually chosen one specific criteria and applied that to a particular culture. But for instance, the Yoruba, we illustrate through the concept of iwontunwonsi, which means moderation, but they also have a concept called didogba, symmetry, kekeres, which is delicacy, refinement, didon, smoothness, and most significantly in this context, ifarajon, clarity. And that concept of clarity is also present among the same Bamana people. So we saw the powerful, crusty, zoomorphic helmet mask, and here we have one example of several in the exhibition of a broad category called as chiwara, but more specifically a subgenre called sogoni-kun or gonzon-kun. And these objects, they don't represent dibi or darkness or obscurity, but clarity or visibility, which the Bamana people call jaya or jayan. And these preferences for clarity refer again to that preference for moderation, for temper, for a tempered behavior and a tempered beauty as well. The avoidance of excesses, and then specifically visibility in the preference for readily recognizable visual compositions, a comprehensible configuration of form and color that leads to easily discernible parts. In sculpture, this predilection for clearly defined volumes, sharp renderings of line and mass, and a distinct use of color, they all enhance the perceptibility, the visibility of line and mass. And they also underline the visibility of parts and the whole. And so these elements, along with surface smoothness, contribute to the visual clarity of the object. This preference for transparency in the rendition of the subject matter underlines the fact that these kind of headdresses are performed in an acrobatic way, are moving around by a talented dancer, and that they're difficult to read if they become too complicated and too convoluted. So that's why the Bamana people appreciate the abstraction and the reduction of form in order to convey the message as easily and as readily as possible. But there are, again, deeper motivations behind the importance of clarity. These dances where these masks appear, they celebrate architecture, agriculture, farming, and they refer agriculture and farming, again, are dependent on a certain range of qualities. And those qualities are liked in human life among the Bamana in general. And the Jaya or Jaya, this element of clarity and visibility, is ultimately allowing people to grasp the core or the essence of something. And they admire the core or essence, not only in objects and in the arts, but also in human behavior, straightforwardness, honesty. Those are ideals that are both of an aesthetic realm and of an ethical, of a moral realm. And even in speech, the Bamana say, which is something that I could learn from, that it's better to apply kumakolo, which is clear and direct speech that gets to the kern, to the essence of the matter, and not divert into details that render things incomprehensible and hard to follow. So with these few ideas, I think I'm going to stop here. I just wanted to shed light on this two core thoughts that appearance matters, of course, in African art, and it matters also when it comes to aesthetics, but aesthetics are more than just about visual form. They denote meaning, and they denote function, and they demonstrate how all these objects have an integral and important role to play in society, and that beauty is ultimately one way to guarantee the success and to realize the purpose of the objects in question. Now, there is still a lot of work to be done in these domains of beauty and ugliness, and I hope that this exhibition can contribute to that. And in the very final room of the exhibition, I think I'm going to end with that slide, and forgive me for not dwelling on this here, but this image shows you two objects that are displayed in the final room of the exhibition under the title Awesome Art. And that idea of awesome art, in a literal sense, refers to objects that were meant to be awe-inspiring, were meant to be, as the Congo people on the left would say, gitukulu. They would literally stop you in your tracks. And these objects are considered to be both beautiful and ugly, both terrorizing and attractive at once. And in focusing on this type of aesthetics, we want to open the door for other forms of aesthetic appreciation or aesthetic categories, that it's not always and only a matter of good or beautiful, of this opposition, but that there is room for other forms of beauty. And this awesome art could also be considered as an expression of what in the West has been called the sublime. And so through this last gallery, we hope indeed that you'll come away with a richer understanding of what aesthetics are and of how to qualify and recognize expression of qualities of beauty and ugliness in works of African art, and then also compare to what extent they coincide, they overlap, or they differ from your own preconceived notions or perceptions of the arts, always keeping in mind that this art is embedded in a vast culture and should be viewed as such through the languages and the vocabularies of the culture in question. So again, I hope you will all go and visit the exhibition now or later, that you bring your family and friends, and I thank you again for spending the afternoon with us here at the Art Institute. Bye.